Chris, take two. What's up, man?
Hey, what's up?
Uh, so you already know this because we already tried recording, but I'm gonna pretend you don't know this. So I am running a rate task trying to get 60,000 records, but I can only get them 100 at a time while being rate limited.
Man, that's an aggressive rate limit,
Well, it's not bad. It's like you get 100 requests a minute. It's like, but I just there's so many records I have to get.
Okay, 100 a minute's not horrible, but it's still like there's no batching. That sucks.
I'm on page 303 and I have 620 pages to get through.
Is it here's the real question. Is it rate limiting by API token or is it rate limiting by IP address?
I don't know.
Because then you could just spin up the same script on a bunch of machines and then hit them simultaneously.
By the time I did that, I could have just waited for this job to run.
That's fair.
Yeah, but it's just one big while loop that sleeps every 2 seconds. It's magical.
There you go. You can run it while we're recording a podcast. There you go.
That is the
multitasking
today. And today we are not alone. We have guests.
Hi, Ben. How are you doing?
We are fantastic and happy that you were able to join us.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. So let me introduce myself, and I'm going to throw out like a million things, and then I'm sure we're going to have a ton to talk about. So hey guys, I'm Brittany Martin. I'm the host of the Ruby on Rails podcast. I'm the lead web developer for the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. Day to day, I work with Ruby on Rails to sell tickets for the Symphony Ballet Opera. I also consult for Shine Registry, which is a female-centric registry that helps small businesses get off the ground. My big claim to fame is that I play roller derby as Norma Skates. I play for 2 separate leagues, and I love hitting people. So trying to dodge being hit. So, and then I'm also AWS certified. I just returned from Vegas from reInvent. So yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I actually had a slot machine sound effect, which would have been perfect, but I didn't think we'd talk about Vegas.
My other claim to fame is that I have listened to all of the Remote Review podcasts, and I've made it to the John Cena section. So,
Got it. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I totally messed up and I was like, hey, you still good last week? And you were like, what? So sorry about that. Couple of things I just wanted to chat with you about. We got to meet both Chris and I got to meet you at Southeast Ruby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gave a fantastic talk. If I'm not mistaken, I remember you had like these like jokes in your slide and like people didn't get them, and I was just sitting there like chuckling my head off. I think we maybe even talked about that, but it's fantastic. You're a great speaker, and so glad to have
that. I work on a very small team at the Trust. It's just 3 of us. I do back end, my partner does front end, and then my boss is the director of e-commerce, and he does all the QA and product management. And we are the cheesiest people. I mean, we are bad dad jokes all day. And so when that leaks into my slides, like I'm very proud of myself, but it's bad because I'll practice in front of the 2 of them. They'll think it's hilarious. And other people just don't get my humor.
Oh, yeah. Crowds are tough. They're hit or miss.
For sure.
I one time ended a talk with a slide that I thought was just going to like kill. It was Jeb Bush saying, please clap. And like, I just heard somebody go, oh, and that was it. Well, this bombed. So
you need to always plant someone in the audience and have them tell them when to laugh really loud.
And just like overkill.
Yeah.
Those are my 2 sound effects I got today. So you are doing the Ruby on Rails podcast, which if I'm not mistaken is a podcast that has existed for a while, right? Before, like you weren't the first host.
Absolutely not. It has been going on for many, many years on the 5x5 network. I started listening to it when Sean Devine was running it. And he was just such a great host, and he would bring on a lot of interesting interviews. And then he actually ended up moving it to more of like a co-host situation. And that's where he brought Kyle Daigle on. And basically the podcast was just them talking back and forth, very similar to this podcast. And I really enjoyed it because, you know, I learned how to code about 5 years ago. And so when I was on like the elliptical, I would be listening to them, or after a meetup, I'd be listening to them. And then eventually Sean moved on, and Kyle, you know, started bringing on other people as hosts. And, you know, at one point during an episode, he said, "Hey, I'm looking for more people." And I was like, you know what? Total imposter syndrome, but I'm just going to reach out and say, "Hey, I would like to try." And he ended up bringing me on. And so I ended up being a co-host for a couple of months on the podcast, which was really exciting for me because at the time I was a boot camp instructor, and, you know, being able to tell my students that I was doing this, and it was a lot of fun. But, you know, Microsoft, you know, acquired GitHub, and that's where Kyle is an engineering manager at. And, you know, things just got really busy for him. So the podcast really kind of went away for, I want to say, about 8 months. And so I reached out to Kyle and I was like, "Hey, you know, I really believe in this. If you look out there, there are very few podcasters specifically for Ruby on Rails. There's a decent amount for Ruby, but not specifically for Rails." And so I asked him, and I said, can I take over? And he said, "Sure." And so I've done 8 episodes so far, and it's been really fun.
That's awesome. So trying to do the math in my head, that would mean, so you started being a co-host about a year ago?
Yeah, about a year ago. Yep, that's totally right.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. Have you had any like favorite guests on so far?
Ooh, Eileen Coates, who's a pretty well-known Rails contributor. She was fantastic. But one interesting thing that I'm trying to do is I try to bring on some famous people from the community, just because I know that's going to bring in listenership. But I'm also trying to find people out into the community who would never have been on a podcast before. So I spoke recently at RubyConf Malaysia, and there was just this fantastic talk about GraphQL by this woman named Ankita. And so I ended up, you know, setting up a time. She lives in Singapore, and recorded a podcast with her, and she was amazing. And she's just someone that you never would have heard from. So it's been an interesting mix of guests. So I'm always open to feedback on that. So topics, and I already told you before the show that you mentioned the new Jets framework, and I've already talked to the founder, and going to have him on the next week's podcast.
Sweet. Yeah, I wanted to mention, you know, like I think Jason and I talked, you know, off air about this recently. But basically, you know, like just asking for things, you know, it gets you so far. And that's one of the things that I feel like we're always like nervous about, you know, could I be on the podcast? And, you know, like, what would I talk about? I don't know. And just asking sometimes, you know, gets you so much. And so I think it's really cool that you were like, "Hey, maybe I'll try this." And then here you are, you're running the podcast now.
Absolutely. It's been a big theme in my life, really. Like, I don't know if you guys can agree to this, but I feel like a lot of things that have been positive in my life has just been asking a little question and then it just going from there. It's amazing how many opportunities come up where the person they're so busy, it just doesn't occur to them to offer it to you. And if you spend your entire life just waiting for someone to offer you an opportunity, you're going to spend a lot of time just scrolling through Facebook, just hoping and wishing.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many times when, you know, that happens. Like I get people that email me randomly from GoRail stuff, and we end up becoming friends or whatever because, you know, they just wrote me an email out of the blue, and I may not have even known them before.
That's how we met.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like Jason, you wrote me and asked me if I was going to be going to RailsConf when it was in Kansas City, and I wasn't, but I drove out there anyways just so we could meet, and then here we are. Isn't that crazy?
We had beers at that fancy chip machine place where you like.
Oh yeah, that was fun.
Yeah. Sorry. That's a really good point when you're talking about like just if you sit and wait, like you're not going to get very far. And that's something I struggle with a lot um, because like my anxiety keeps me from wanting to kind of be a go-getter. Really like, oh, like people are gonna like think I'm an idiot, or like they're gonna judge me, or think I'm dumb. And but for the most part, like when I've asked people for things, like there was an example one time, like I really want to get into open source. And so I just started submitting pull requests to this project that like weren't necessarily improvements, but I like thought they would be. And they kept getting rejected. So like I just emailed the owner of the repo and I was like, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm just trying to get an open source and I need help. And like this person responded with like paragraphs and paragraphs.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
Wouldn't have happened had I not like taken the time just to ask. So
Right.
Absolutely. And specifically our community. I mean, I love Ruby so much, and I just feel in particular the people that I interact with in that community are so kind. This has been the year of speaking for me. I've spoken, I think it's 6 different conferences, and I will tell you what, I spent years submitting talk proposals and getting rejected. So if anybody is discouraged about not getting speaking opportunities, just keep at it. The best advice I can give you is to just keep coming up with topics and then vetting them with people that are non-technical. So I go to my friends and say, hey, I'm thinking about speaking about this. You don't know anything about this, but on the surface, does this sound interesting? And then that was really how I started to come up with better talk topics. Also, never submit just one proposal. Always submit multiple proposals.
Those are both good pieces of advice there. I like the idea of talking to people who have no idea about what you're talking about, because that definitely makes it much more beginner friendly. You're making way less assumptions that way when you're writing your proposal that way. That's cool.
So you said you've been to 6 conferences. Have you given the same talk at each, or have you had different talks at all of them?
Yeah, good question. I was just looking over this the other day. It was half and half. So the first half of the year was a talk called Draw a Crowd. I did an open source project for mental health. Basically, it was a real-time map where it was an art installation. So it was built into the cultural district where I work. My work was very generous in giving me a space in order to have this art installation, but using Action Cable, users would submit their experience with mental health, and then that would appear as a puzzle piece onto this real-time map. And so this is an open source project where we have the eventual goal of having other cities and locations like using this art installation to basically distill the stigma around mental health. And so I spoke about half of the year with that talk. And then if you listen to the Ruby on Rails podcast, you've probably heard me talk about how we had the Hamilton on sale this year, which is the biggest on sale that our website has ever had. We had 300,000 people try to get tickets at once. And so my talk for the second half of the year was talking about how to handle bad users and not necessarily trap them out of your website, but how to gracefully degrade their experience on your website.
Yeah, I remember that the security talk coming through the Southeast Ruby CFP, and like, you get a good handful of security talks, but it was like the title was Rails Against the Machine. Is that the name of it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. I was like, okay, like that caught my attention. And then it was like, this sounds like a fun talk. So yeah, that's cool.
I will tell you my secret weapon, and I don't know about you guys. I actually don't know your formal backgrounds, like how you became developers, but I was not a traditional developer. I have a degree in marketing. And so I spent many years in marketing and product management. And then I went through a boot camp and became a developer. But every once in a while, especially with like writing talks, I'm like, I'm going to pull that marketing hat back on and like really, because it is a skill that usually is not so celebrated in the technical community. And I think it's something that we should be excited about should people have those skills.
Yeah. There's whatever bias that developers, I remember going through school for computer science and just being like, oh, we're developers. We don't like English classes and whatever else. And we try and avoid this at all costs. And looking back, I'm like, that was really dumb. Like, writing is probably more important than the code you can write in a lot of cases. Like, being able to communicate is far, far more important, So I think things like marketing and all that developers just tend to write off these other skills, and that's definitely not a good thing in the long run.
Well, plus, Chris, you're running a business. Like, I mean, that is not
Hmm.
learn, in a computer science degree. So I'm sure you've learned a lot, like trial by fire, but um,
Yeah, and it's
I've been-
it's just slow to teach yourself a lot of those things, but yeah, you have to, I feel like one of the complaints I have of a lot of developers is a lot of them don't think about the business. They think about just solving the problem they're given, and I'm like, you could solve this 50 different ways, but you should think about what's best for the business. And then I feel like those developers are the ones that can be the best paid, the most well paid, because they're thinking about those business decisions. They're probably also going to be the ones that are better to manage, more developers as you grow in your career and stuff, thinking about all that.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I wish that. So I took a kind of informal path in, like Chris, like I did CS classes, but I was a dropout. But like I think about going back to school, and I always think if I go, it would be for like business or something.
I recommend it, but honestly, the most that I've learned is just from trying to get like businesses going on my side, like just by like doing it in real life. And it's tough because for me, even coding wise, I don't learn things unless I have to. So like with Chris, like he needs to like pay his server costs. Like there's no like messing around with that. Like, it has to be done.
Right.
Which is
To make your bills. So like it's much more. I have a hard time with like a test scenario actually like learning from it.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. That's if I don't have a purpose for learning something, it just makes it that much less interesting, and I get distracted and whatever a lot easier. Um, and that's one of the things that I was consulting before I started Go Rails, and I was always working on stuff on the side because I, was always trying to start a business. But I actually January 1st of like 2014, I like quit consulting cold turkey. I had whatever savings I had, and I was like, I'm gonna make this work. And that was kind of like, if I burn my bridges, I'm gonna force myself to learn this stuff. And it didn't really work out over those first 9 months, but I eventually started to get some momentum. But I ran out of savings and had to get a job for a year. But it did, force me to learn a lot of that stuff that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Was it stressful knowing that you had that on you? And like, do you ever feel stressed that people see the success you've had and think that it was easy? Because I mean, it sounds like it was really hard.
Oh yeah, it's so funny when people are like, "Oh, you must make so much money and it must be so easy." And you're like, "You realize that it takes, Ryan Bates had said for Railscast like a video could take him 40 hours." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, if you're doing a topic that you aren't super familiar with, 40 hours is to make like a 15-minute video at the end of 40 hours of work. Like that's very common. Luckily some of them are easier if you know the topic well, but you not only have to do that, but you have to figure out how to share it and to get people to come to your site, and then even give them enough where they're like, oh, maybe this is worth paying for, which is a whole other thing you have to worry about. So yeah, it was a whirlwind of things to learn.
I don't know.
So,
I still think he was money bags all over.
Jason, so how did you get into web development then?
So I started off. I like tricked the music store I worked at in high school that I had built websites before, and I was like, "Yeah, I'll build a website." And then I was like, "Okay, now what do I do?" And so I learned front end development, and I had a friend who was at the time an ASP Classic developer, so he like helped me with some back end stuff there. But I spent like 6 or 7 years just doing front end. I was mostly into music. Like music was my life. And then I burned out and found programming in like a .NET class at college. And I was like, this is awesome. And then did some school, was really bad at math, real bad. And said, this is a lot of money that I am paying to this institution for being here like 3 years past what a normal person is at school for. So I dropped out, and around that time I started getting into like Rails. I had actually just got my first job as like a WordPress dev, and then got out of WordPress, moved into Rails, and here I am.
I think that's awesome because people love to complain about WordPress, and you can like actually legitimately complain about it. I've actually never had to use it, but it's like such an old thing. Like it's such a thing that people use. They're like, well, at least it's not WordPress. So
Yeah, WordPress is such a fascinating like world.
it is.
Yeah, like Chris and I have talked about it, like the idea that like you can make these plugins and they actually like solve really really hard problems really easily, but they're like, pay us, and I'm like, yes, I'll pay you $100 a year for this thing because it's saved me like hours of my time.
Absolutely. No, that's awesome.
Yeah, I feel it's kind of strange that we don't have sort of the equivalent in Rails. There's so much more of like oh, I can build it myself, and it's like, yeah, but do you want to? When really the only thing we have that I see commonly is like, people pay for Sidekick, but there's not a whole lot of other things. There's more around error and performance monitoring, but there's not a whole lot of options, which seems strange.
No, you're right. And we actually just became paid users of Sidekick because for Hamilton, we needed the ability that if Redis were to falter, that the jobs would store and, we would get the
Right.
informations out. And so we became Sidekick Pro users, and I'm happy to pay him that because I mean he does an incredible job. But you're right, all other Ruby on Rails costs are going to AWS, Honey Badger, Skylight, New Relic, and that's about it.
Yeah, feels like we should have more. Like Laravel just announced their admin interface. It's like $100. I don't know if it was a year or whatever, but it's like, well, we don't really have a good admin interface in Rails, and I think if people were willing to spend $100 on something like that, we would have a phenomenal one.
Yeah.
If that was someone's job making an admin, that would be so much better quality. So I would love to see that evolve in the community.
I agree.
The other thing is that like I'm really happy to pay someone like for things that make my life easier. So if that was Ruby, that'd be awesome. But at least like I understand Ruby better than I understand WordPress. Like I used to try and make my own plugins like for the websites I was building, and like it's just a mess. So
I imagine it's way more complicated for everybody now that what was it, Gutenberg, the React front end, is shipped. I can only imagine how much like chaos that's caused for them.
So I like one of our first episodes, I talked about moving my blog to Jekyll.
Yes.
And then I didn't write a single blog post after I did it because like I didn't want to like pull the repo down. Like it actually seemed like more hassle. So I just moved it back to WordPress. And the next day, WordPress 5 came out, and dude, Gutenberg's pretty sweet. So,
well, that's good to hear. I had not heard. Most of it was complaints about change. People just didn't want things to change, and I was like, well, whatever. Like one thing about Ruby is like I've been always impressed with how willing the community is to adopt the latest Ruby and the latest Rails and all of that. Like people upgrade pretty consistently because when I came from Python before I was doing Ruby. And, Python 3 was out for years and no one was upgrading. And I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Like, no one's willing to upgrade ever. And even still, there's stuff on Python too.
Oh, yeah.
And like, that was just the thing that I loved about the Ruby community. Like, the latest and greatest stuff we could actually enjoy. That was fantastic.
People just learn the flags of when you're creating a new Rails project to remove the things that the new features that they don't want.
Yeah, which is hilarious. But, at least they get to take advantage of some of it. And then over time, they can, take more time to learn TurboLinks or whatever it is that they're struggling with. And then it becomes easier when you've got like Stimulus solves kind of all the front end JavaScript problems that TurboLinks introduced. Just took a long time for them to come out with that. But, it slowly allows you to adopt all those new things.
Absolutely. We maintain 4 different Rails applications at the Trust. And when I came in, the main application was being upgraded from 2 to 4. And that was rough. But then once we got
Ooh,
down to 4,
yeah.
I've been able to keep it up. So, I mean, everything's on 5.2 now, which is nice.
Yeah, I remember using, I think I started Rails before Bundler, where it was like config.gems or something, where you listed the gem dependencies in one of the Rails config files.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. Luckily, Bundler exists.
Do you?
I would like
Oh,
to talk more about that art project that you did.
yeah, for sure.
So is that like your brainchild? Like, were you the only person who did this project?
No, such a good question. So I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we had every single year there is a nonprofit hackathon called Steel City Hacks. And what they do, and this is my favorite kind of hackathon. I used to be a hackathon junkie before I actually became a developer, which is really funny. I would go in as like a business person, but so much more fun once you know how to code. But
No doubt.
Right.
I don't like going to hackathons where I'm not given any direction as to what to build. I like to build things that actually matter and are actually going to be used. And so this hackathon, you got partnered with a nonprofit. And so we partnered with a consultancy called McCoy Creative, and they had come up with this concept. And what was even better is that Jason, who's the head of the consultancy, is a UX designer. And so he was able to give us all the assets, which is so helpful when you're building a project. To not have to pull a designer to do that kind of thing. So it ended up being a team of 6. We competed. We did not win, but we really believed in the project. And so we ended up, of course, scrapping it and starting over again, because nothing you build over a weekend is normally what you actually want. And so my partner at the Trust, Danielle Greaves, and I restarted the app and have been working on it since.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I haven't gone to too many hackathons recently, but I used to go to some startup weekends in St. Louis, and oh man, those are still some of the places where I had the most fun and like met people who've been longtime friends since then. I really, really like that sort of, get together and then go do something over a weekend mentality. It's so much fun.
I agree. I did a hackathon in San Francisco. I spent 2 years in San Francisco. I wanted to see what the tech community was truly like out there. And I recommend maybe not necessarily moving there, but giving it a visit for sure. It's weird to train and seeing people scream about QA.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. But I was at this hackathon in San Francisco, and there was a group of men next to me, and they had this like very strict schedule as to how they were going to develop their app. And they had a sleep schedule where every 6 hours, 2 of them would go to sleep and then 2 of them would be awake. And supposedly their app would be being worked on this entire time. Well, their schedule was so good that the 2 sets never spoke to each other. And so they assumed that one another was doing the work. And so at the end of the hackathon, they had built nothing.
Oh,
That's funny. Yeah, we had similar things like that happen on ours, where it was like, oh, I thought you guys were doing this, and then it's like an hour before the demo, and it's like, oh, we have nothing.
So going back to contextual camouflage, which is the name of the project, it is very simple. It can be hosted on Heroku. I love those Heroku buttons that you can add into your GitHub READMEs.
Oh yeah, those are great.
And they're so great because, granted, once you get like attached to Heroku and you have a production app running on there, it can get very expensive. But I mean, Heroku's solid. So if you're looking for like something lightweight, Heroku can be really great. And so those buttons are really helpful. But it was nice because I've always wanted to speak at RailsConf, but again, imposter syndrome. It just seemed like a very scary thing to apply for. But they had a new track this year called Unusual Rails Applications. And so I was like, hey, I mean, this is pretty unusual. The people are using Action Cable in production. Boom, boom, right there. Just kidding. But But I applied and got into it. There was only maybe 4 speakers in that track, and it was a lot of fun. What was funny though is, how at the beginning, like at the front of the room, they typically have those like very large signs as to like what sessions are in that room. I
Mhm.
approached them after and I was like, can I have my sign? And they're like, that sign's like 15 feet tall. And I was like, yeah, I want it. There's pictures of me dragging it down the street back to my office because RailsConf was in Pittsburgh this year. And
Yeah.
it's mounted behind my desk and it looks absolutely ridiculous.
You're lucky that it was in Pittsburgh.
It's so wild because we were both at RailsConf. We had no idea. I had no idea who you were then.
Oh yeah. I mean, I am still like making my way into the community. It was weird the other day when I got introduced as a speaker, and they're like, "You know her as the voice of the Ruby on Rails podcast." I'm like,
"That's cool."
People listen to that.
Yeah, we look at our downloads and we're like, "Oh, I don't know if they're listening, but people do download this. I guess it's worth keeping going."
Yeah, we just assume you're all bots.
Well, you're talking to a listener right now, so it is.
Are you a bot?
So the other thing I was really interested to talk to you about is your AWS certification.
Yeah.
So AWS, to this day, I'll use it like S3 and stuff, but it scares the mess out of me. You open the menu and it takes over the entire screen and scrolls. So do you know about all of that?
I don't know about all of it. So number one, I have a theory that AWS makes their console scary on purpose so that non-technical people don't go in there. I have this theory. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's a stickiness thing because it's almost like Microsoft Word. You know how some people can't function without Microsoft Word? I feel that AWS does that where people are like, oh, I know where to click. So I can't ever go to Google or Azure for hosting just because I'll be confused.
Right.
But at the trust, our sysops, our director of cloud infrastructure, there is, I think, 7 certifications in AWS, and he has all of them, which is pretty impressive.
Jeez.
So when I came in, the trust was getting pretty involved with AWS, and so both my boss and I decided it would be good for us to get certified, just so that we could understand the ecosystem of where we were deploying to. So I'm a certified developer, which is one of the, I'm not going to say easier certificates, but it's a certificate that's focused specifically on developer tools like CDNs, hosting, CI. Deployment tools. I think it's really amusing that AWS has their own version of GitHub. I will never use it, but it is definitely out there. It's called Code Commit.
Yeah, I remember that. They have so many services these days.
We use 33 of them.
Jeez. How does it? Do you have unexpected bills sometimes?
Yeah.
Well,
not unexpected, but I mean, again, for Hamilton, we had to scale up so much. And it wasn't even the on sale that we had to scale so much for, but we spent a good year and a half just making sure that our system was resilient against attacks. And again, just high traffic. And so we would scale up and do a lot of load testing. And that's what really gets you, because you're not even making money on load testing.
Yeah, you're just burning money.
Exactly. A little disheartening, but the good news is that, you're only going to go through so many Hamiltons in your life. But now our system's better than ever. And, I'm really proud of the fact that I can say our site is built on Ruby on Rails and was able to handle traffic. So Rails can scale. You heard it here.
Yeah.
So are you mostly with the hosting on AWS using EC2 instances, things like that?
Yep. We use Code Pipeline. So anytime we merge into our staging branch or our master branch, we use something called Code Pipeline. And what it does is it will pull that new code from GitHub, and then it will run our CI tests using Code Build. And then it uses a thing called Code Deploy, which is an agent that lives on the servers, and it deploys out to that. So I don't know about you guys, but I am not a huge fan of, what is the deployment tool that everyone uses for Rails that starts with a C?
Capistrano.
Not a fan. So that was one of the first things I ripped out of the app when I joined the trust. I've always had, it's always felt like a deck of cards to me, where I'll deploy Capistrano, something's wrong, and people are like, oh, you didn't remember to move that one file over every time we do a Capistrano deploy. I'm like, what? And so I didn't want to have to maintain that kind of app code in the application anymore. I'm more than happy to offload that to AWS because it does such a reliable job of deploying out our code to the right servers.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so it helps us too because we use Lambda, which is their serverless, pretty famous serverless function to take a server, we deploy the code to it, and then we actually copy that server into an autoscale group. And then we then scale out that server across all of and then it's almost like a blue-green deployment, and then we retire our old servers. And so, I mean, that's not something that I'm going to be able to do with Capistrano. So we've been pretty happy with our AWS setup. But, AWS has us where they want us because we're sticky to AWS at this point.
Yeah, there's no migrating that off to another service.
Absolutely. Plus, they won't honor my certificate, and that's just completely.
Let's get down to the real reason here.
So, real reason is that when you're at reInvent, which is their massive Vegas conference, there is a lounge for certified.
You can get one at the airport too.
I wish. That would be so sweet. That would be a smart move, actually. That conference is getting so big. I think this year there were 42,000 people at the conference.
Jeez.
Whoa, that's nuts.
I mean, when you go between talks, you're looking at least a mile walk in order to get between sessions. You start having to book your sessions based on where they are, no longer on the topic.
Whoa.
It's pretty nuts. So I really think at some point they're going to have to break it up into like different countries or something, because it is absolutely crazy. But it's a lot of fun. I love going to reInvent. So one funny trick about reInvent. So here's my insider tip for people who ever are going to attend reInvent or are interested. Always sign up for a vague workshop towards the end of the week. So if you see a workshop that says something like machine learning or deep learning and it has zero information about it, always sign up for that workshop, because throughout the week they make exciting announcements. And this year they announced their deep learning car. So it's like an actual toy car that you can, it has a simulator on it. And so you can teach this toy car to drive around. And since I signed up for that vague workshop, it became that toy car workshop, and I got a free car, and they are going to sell those for $500 a piece. So
That's
awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. The car is sitting right next to me. I have not set it up yet, but I'm going to. They provide stickers so that way you can really like make your car look rad. But that was a nice surprise. And then something you guys touched on is that they are going to be supporting Ruby in Lambda, which is awesome. It's something I've been begging for years. They've always supported Go, Python, .NET, Java, C++, but they've never supported Ruby. And so every year I'm like, this is the year they're going to announce Ruby. And everyone tells me, oh, it's not exciting enough. They're not going to announce that. And when they announced it on stage, I went bananas. So
just start punching all those people that rely. He'll never be there.
The problem is that everyone turned to me and they're like, when are you going to turn our application into serverless? And I'm like, oh yeah, I don't have that.
That's awesome. Yeah, we use some AWS in my previous job. My, I guess, CTO there, it's like really, really like levels above me, like the way he thinks, and he knows like AWS like inside and out, and he'd be like, yeah, we'll just do this. I can't even like fake the terms. And I was like, cool, man, whatever you say. Well,
I was going to say, I like to think it's my superpower because you guys might not know this, but I really don't do much front end. So like CSS and JavaScript are definitely my arch nemesis. So whoever does that, I give you so much respect and accolades. I pretty much stay in Ruby, but my superpower is that I also can do DevOps as well. So instead of going to the front, I just go further into the back. So give me databases all day, give me math, I'm happy. Ask me to style a bullet point and you have got me. I can't do it. So We all have our special skills.
Exactly.
We'll have to have you back on to just talk with Chris about Hatchbox and AWS.
That'd be awesome. I mean, Chris and I met when I was working customer support for a hosting company. So
Yeah.
we go with,
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah,
When was that? That was quite a while ago.
it was back in
2015?
Yeah. 2014. Yep. You're right.
Okay. Yeah. That was, and then it wasn't until Southeast Ruby that we got to meet in person.
Ruby friends.
Yeah. Earlier when Jason mentioned the 6 conferences, I thought he was going to ask you, you've went to 6 conferences this year, and why was Southeast Ruby your favorite?
Well, Chris just asked it. Go ahead.
You know what? I honestly, completely honest, Southeast Ruby was absolutely one of my favorites. I have learned that small conferences are my thing. And I made such amazing friends at Southeast Ruby. Like there were a couple dinners that I just went out to that I made such incredible connections. And it was a very accessible conference. I thought you did a wonderful job, Jason. I would absolutely come back again. And I'm going to definitely recommend other people to attend. I thought as an organizer, it was really well done. So you should be really proud of yourself for that.
Well, I really appreciate that. That means a lot. There was one other thing, and I lost it. I don't know. I got nothing.
All right.
Dang it. What was it? You took me aback by your kind words about the conference. I don't remember. Anyway, this has been fun. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And, keep up the great podcast. And just remember, no matter what, you always got this listener. So if you ever
there we go.
record, just know that Brittany's waiting. And so get to it, guys.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and we will all chat soon.
Sounds great. Bye, everyone. Happy holidays.
See ya.